Wow. Welcome and thank you for participating in this Mental Health International webinar on a very interesting topic that I want to share with you today. My name is Kora Klapp. I'm a Mental Health International certification trainer doing courses, and I see that there's several here of my students as well, and I'm so very happy to meet you here again, and everybody else who is going to go on this journey together with us. So just to begin, so we who are doing mental health, we often have so much fun when we are doing this, because we're connecting the dots with biological reactions and their metaphorical meanings. And what I mean by that, I just want to share a very short story that I actually shared in a blog post before. So, and that was about a guy who I coached, and he told me about his hands that had become so very dry on the inner surfaces and a little bit scaly around those borders. And well, and I thought, yeah, okay, and what's happened with that? Since when has that appeared? Well, a couple of days ago. And well, what did you do? Did you touch a lot of stuff that you shouldn't touch, like hand sanitizer, lots of, or something like that? No, was not the case. And so, yeah, well, what do you think? How do these hands feel to you? What is your impression when you feel into those hands? And so describe those symptoms for me. And he said, well, they are feeling just like a fisherman's hands. Oh, a fisherman's hands. So what's that? What's that about? Oh, well, that's this kind of dryness that I think that somebody is getting who gets into contact with a lot of salt water and fish all the time and so on. And well, so this was already opening a door for me into the kind of inner map of this thing that was going on there. And I was asking, so okay, it's now a couple of days ago before that appeared. Well, what might that have been for a kind of slippery fish that you as a fisherman couldn't kind of get a hold of? Oh, I said, well, that hasn't been a fish. That actually was a situation, because I got a phone call of somebody who told me about a situation I'm involved in, and I'm actually I'm now in remote control, or I'm not in control of that stuff. I can't really do a lot about that, but I see something, I feel something happening, it's kind of slipping out of my hands. Oh, well, okay. So that was actually an easy door, this metaphor to the conflict that he had been experiencing. And we know in mental health, well, something with the skin and getting dry and so on, that has to do with contact, right? With contact, separation, something. And yeah, that was what it was about, like a slippery fish. And well, and we worked that out. And he made a new decision about what he could let go of that, or what he could decide that he really wanted to focus on, that gave his hands a good feel in being able to hold that, right? And yeah, well, he did that. And then after a couple of days more, everything was back to normal. And that's what we love in mental health, if that happens in that way, right? Without a lot of complications, we find out about a conflict that has been happening and has led to some changes. And then by just kind of magically dig a little bit into the brain, into the imagination of people, and the kind of imprint they're having. So then we can change that, and they can heal. And now, after this little story, I want to start my screen share and just recap what we know about that healing cycle. About that healing cycle that we are using in mental health, that is according to Dr. Harmer's research, this German surgeon who does not live any longer, but left a testimony of the German new medicine, or the biological laws they are called, or this kind of research, really about the biosocial psychological connections, right? So that we also have based our mental health coaching and interventions on. So, okay, you might know this here already, but I just want to recap. So first, just like the guy who I was meeting, we're in a healthy rhythm. So we are of an activity, and then a restorative sleep and relaxation, and everything can be replenished, rejuvenated overnight, and all of that normally. And then what happens at this number 2 point? We might have some certain stress triggers, just like the kind of phone call that guy got, that is prompting a stress response, which can be mobilizing, or a plus response, or an inhibitory response, a minus kind of response. So where we can't act out of the kind of stress we were feeling. And a little bit in the case of that guy, it was kind of both, because he wanted to act out, but he really couldn't do it. He couldn't really solve anything. So that's what made this his own body, his biology, try to help him with that, right? So in this number 3 stress phase, we are seeing that prolonged activity, activity or a disruption, plus or a minus, when the challenge, as long as the challenge is not solved, and this can lead to tissue changes, just as already happened in that case of the fisherman hands, right? And we in Meta Health, we are asking about those specific symptoms, and also when they appeared or when they reappeared, to be able to deduce certain things from that, and learn what can be behind and what needs to be resolved and healed. So then when this happens and something is resolved, either consciously or unconsciously, right, resolution happens, and we switch into the regeneration mode. And this often happens like really unconsciously. Something is just resolving itself without we perhaps having learned something through the process. And that's the difference that mental health coaching makes, because we want to make things conscious. And okay, so therefore, when we switch into the regeneration mode, so that's a very different type. And often then we get even more and stronger symptoms than in the stress phase. So there's a reversal going on if we had those tissue changes, and we can feel very tired, as we know that we have to regenerate and replenish, and our body needs its time out for that. And often there's a lot going on inside the body if there's, again, tissue changes in reversal mode, right? So therefore, we can feel emotionally unstable, we can feel quite diseased, quite sick, we can have fever, we're vulnerable for certain infections, and so on and so on. So we're often feeling much more sick when we actually have resolved something and getting in regeneration phase. But in the case of my fisherman's hands, this didn't happen, right? Because when we are catching something that hasn't run so very, very deep yet, right? Or we can create circumstances where somebody is very well resourced. This is not necessary that these things need to happen, right? And that's obviously when meta health is most fun to do, right? To not have to lead somebody through all that kind of hardship that a regeneration phase can bring. Then we can feel, sometimes we feel it, often we don't feel it, the healing peak, which if we feel it, it feels quite short and shaky. And this is because then our body tries to get rid of the rest of frozen energy that is still stored in our tissues and in our brain. So that's what the body is trying to do then. And then we actually switch into another phase of regeneration, which is then about getting back to normal, about being able to excrete the waste and all of that, and really to to start healing and regaining our function, right? So, and that's what's happening in the second part of the regeneration phase here. Symptoms getting lighter and lighter if we had them in the first place, right? Swellings would recede, scarring might happen, yeah, and we would get back into more and more normal function. Perhaps it would be kind of swinging out a bit, right? The auto-regulation. And this is what every mental health practitioner is aware about and working with, right? And we know sometimes this is happening according to this model, and sometimes it can be more complicated or more easy. Now, Dr. Hammer, who actually formulated all of that and gave us his research and his model, he was talking about biological special programs, right? So he said that that basically all disease processes there are meaningful programs that should help us resolve a conflict that we have often perceived in a psychological manner, just like my guy that I had with the fisherman hands, but the body tries to resolve it in a biological way, which then means it's good if we can decode that, if we understand what the body's trying to do, but if we don't, we feel quite sick in the way of the process, right? So, but then Dr. Hammer said, yeah, this is about almost all disease processes, but not about, not everything is actually happening according to his laws or to his model. And that's also why I was asking this guy with his hands first, well, have you been in contact to a lot of soap or sanitizer or whatever stuff, whatever kind of toxic plastic or something, because this is also that something can happen and has its impact on our organ, our skin or whatever. And so there are certain exceptions that Dr. Hammer already mentioned, and these are those physical trauma or kind of like accidents when we break our arm or something like that, sprain our ankle like I did when we latest went hiking, or like the poisoning and toxins. And this is what lots of things nowadays are about, I think. So we really can't get a whole picture when we ignore those, right? So we need to get also in touch with those kinds of possibilities, then which also is about frequencies and radiation and all of that microwave wave and mobile phone and whatever stuff and 5G and whatever it's called, right? Yeah, which also has an impact upon us. And then obviously deficiencies, right? When we don't get enough, or when our body is creating deficiencies because it's not able, not capable of really taking the vital stuff, the good stuff, the vitamins, the elements and all the nutrition of what we're eating, for instance, right? Or where we are. So that is also a possibility, which we also need to take into account. Just like also in many kinds of chronic diseases. So the second picture I have here is actually from, it's shown, yeah, what happens in people who have like the chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, right? With lots of pains kind of everywhere. And well, we can decode this like bit for bit and seeing what kinds of problems, what kind of conflicts are you having here and there and everywhere and after each other. But then there's also something systemic to it. And we can't rule out that something like those exceptions are playing a role too. So therefore, I was very, very excited in getting to know some new research, right? And that was about the so-called cell danger response. So here we've got a guy, Dr. Robert K. Naviaux, who's a professor of medicine and pediatrics pathology at the University of California in San Diego. And actually, basically what I'm doing here in this in the first part of this webinar, I'm quoting a lot of what he is saying in his own words in his research, because he actually does that quite so much that we can understand it as normal human beings too. Right? So what's happening in that cell danger response? He said, when cells go to war, they do what nations do when they go to war. When the CDR is activated, cells harden their borders, they don't trust their neighbors, and restrict the exchange of resources with their neighbors, right? So each single cell can do that. Yeah, and then we are very much alone. And like this is happening, like under siege, as you see it a little bit with that cannon there behind a wall in the photo that I put there. Well, what's happening then? Yeah, we might be better protected for a certain time, but we are relying on our stores and our resources. And at a certain time, we just don't have them anymore, and that's not a good thing. It was biologically meaningful to do so, but not in the long run. And that's something that we know from mental health. Also, when something is triggered and triggered and triggered again in a way of conflicts, well, it's also leading to responses that are not so meaningful any longer, right? So let me show you what's happening there in this little graphic in the cell danger response, and again with a quote from Dr. Naviaux. So what you see there is a graphic of actually it's taken from a little video from an amoeba, which I shared in my trainings. Now I just took this picture for any kind of cell that we are having. So that is now getting a biological conflict. And he said, to understand why our cells might choose to defend themselves from harm by intentionally making reactive oxidant species, such as superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, and by stiffening the cell membrane to make it less permeable and less vulnerable to attack, we need to start at the beginnings of life on our planet. So I just showed you, so that the kind of like bulwark that the cell was creating by creating those reactive oxygen species and sending them like out of the cell to harden the borders and make it like better, to make the defense better, right? Just like what we discussed in that last slide. And this quote is from an article he published in Perspectives in Pharmacology, and is called Oxidative Shielding or Oxidative Stress. And I think everybody here has heard about oxidative stress. Oh, there's a lot too many free radicals and they're not good for us. They are causing aging, they're causing all kinds of trouble. And now this guy is turning everything kind of around, just like Dr. Hammer did in his way, and say, well, what we perceive as something that is diseased is actually a biologically meaningful thing that the cells or the body is attempting to do. Okay, so what do we look at when we're looking to the beginnings of life on our planet? That's when the big oceans were there, and there were just those this unicellular organisms around, actually like my little amoeba there. And they had obviously also to defend themselves against each other, against any kinds of threat that were there, because yeah, they needed to eat something. I'm not a cell biologist, really. I don't know whether they kind of ate each other or something like that. But if you're putting those oxygen species out there, they are very effective in actually eating away anything that should be, that you want to protect from. So from that perspective, he looked and found, well, this is actually a meaningful reaction that we then as organisms took over from those early species on our planet. Now, let's look at those unicellular organisms such as bacteria and what we have as them in our body. And so now we're looking, for example, to our mitochondria. Mitochondria, actually, they were like bacteria that got into symbiosis with our body and with our cells. So they migrated into our cells and became integrated parts of our organisms, just as you see on this picture I took from Wikipedia. Right? So what are the roles of those inside our body? So almost everybody thinks of, oh, mitochondria, they are those powerhouses, right? So they are the ones who are giving us the energy to do all kinds of things. But what they also do is that they're actually monitoring their environment, their surroundings, both like inside the cells, right, and communication also inside the cells and also between the cells. So this is also something what the mitochondria do, and the way in which they do this is by creating, when they think, oh, everything's okay, right, all is well, like those people on the ship, that like the lookouts, that they would report back to the captain, like all is well on the forecastle, right? So mitochondria are doing this in creating this kind of a halo around themselves, communicating that, yeah, okay, so we can do our work, everything is fine. And then these mitochondria, having a shape and a function, also they are anti-inflammatory. So they are not promoting inflammation in the body, because inflammation obviously is also some defensive strategy. When we need to put something out of our body that doesn't belong there, what our body usually does, it's creating inflammation around it and then it expels it, right? So apart from inflammation often being a part of a regeneration phase, and we will come to that a little bit later again. So, and just under these circumstances, when all is well, then they are those powerhouses of the body, because they're creating ATP adenosine triphosphate, right, as a method of energy storage, so that it can be forwarded and used for all kinds of actions for our nerves, for our muscles, for many things that our body needs to do. And in this process of creating this ATP, so this is happening in this so-called cell respiration, right? So because the mitochondria need a lot of oxygen for that. So it's an aerobic process to actually use the energy of the glucose, of the sugar, most efficiently. So there are several ways to do this. The most effective one is this one, which is using a lot of oxygen. Okay, so what's happening when in the cell danger response, when our cells are feeling threatened by whatever that doesn't belong to us and make the cells feel, I need to protect myself. So then they are very rapidly changing their shape and their function. And I took this graphic out of a study where they actually proved this, and you see this also in those little graphics, how they differ from each other, right? Here you see the filament like shape of the structures, and in the other picture it's looking much more fragmented. So this is clearly visible if you have the means to make it visible, right? So, and this means that there happens a transformation of the shape and function of the mitochondria into a pro-inflammatory type. So they are promoting inflammation as a protective measure, obviously. And this initiate the response of oxidative shielding, which I just showed you in that little graphic with the amoeba, right? Because the possible damage needs to be controlled, right? So, and stopped. But this obviously, as under siege, this will lead in the end to a lack of oxygen, right? So for the creation of the ATP, which means that, well, we don't get that good and effective type of energy any longer. And this actually is happening in any kind of wound healing also for a little amount of time before we get back into the normal cycle, right? And as long as this oxidative shielding response is happening, the energy is produced in another way by glycolysis. And this is not happening inside the mitochondria, but outside. And it is also leaving some remnants, such as lactic acid. And we know lactic acid as something we have when we have those muscle aches, right? After doing too much training and so on. And this mirrors the kinds of pains that somebody with a fibromyalgia also is having, right? So lactic acid is playing a role in that response too, right? And that is a chronic kind of thing that is happening, which means that obviously this kind of oxidative shielding response is still active in a way in people. And well, and we're kind of stuck in that response. Yeah. So yeah, and during that also the cooperation between those cells that belong to that organism or to that organ even, right? So the cooperation is decreased or even suspended. Okay, not good. So that tells us why people are getting so tired in those kinds of chronic diseases, because their energy is produced in a different way or wasted, kind of. It's not produced that effectively. Yeah, and they are stuck in a response that is might not longer be that meaningful for them. But we end up in a kind of hibernation response in our cells, in our body. Good. So that's about those mitochondria and what's happening there. And now, again, about like the fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome here, another quote from Dr. Naviaux: our results in those studies show that cellular bioenergetic fatigue and cellular defense are two sides to the same coin in ME or CFS. When energy is used for cellular defense, it is not available for normal cell function like growth, repair, neuroendocrine, and autonomic nervous system functions, right? So we are not into the usual where we can replenish our body, yeah, because we don't get out of this kind of defense cycle. And from where do we know that in Meta Health? I think you might remember this kind of graphic when we are talking about, well, we have certain overlaps in different processes, right? If we have simultaneously a certain process which is in a regeneration phase and it wants to replenish and do all that in a hopefully uncomplicated way, this can be complicated by having something else again still in stress phase, or again triggering those stresses. And these are kind of those two coins, two sides to the same coin. Yeah, we might think about the famous collecting tubule syndrome, kidney collecting tubule syndrome, right? When we are having something that is giving us unfavorable conditions for healing, right? When we are not getting not collecting a lot energy because we are in more pain, because we feel more edema, in all kinds of things. So, and there are hormones involved in all kinds of pathways, obviously. But in meta health, we are knowing that those things might be connected to certain conflicts that are underlying the whole thing, like a feeling of not being in my right environment, the feeling of being left completely alone, in those kinds of things. And we need to address those first, as to take this kind of defensive response away, right? So this can also make yet a little bit more sense, knowing from this kind of research. So this is actually fits very well together. So let's look at the chronic disease. And again, a quote: chronic disease results when cells are caught in a repeating loop of incomplete recovery and re-injury, unable to fully heal. This biology is at the root of virtually every chronic illness known, says Dr. Naviaux, right? And this is, again, reminding us of a graphic that we are having in meta health, where you also see, okay, we are being re-triggered. We are having certain conflicts all over and over again, because we never really healed it from the root, from all the soil, with all the resources we could have, because we still are vulnerable to being re-triggered. And the more vitality we lose on the way, the stronger the symptoms get, right? So, and this is actually matching very well this kind of repeating loop. So this can be a completely biochemical kind of thing, as Dr. Naviaux describes. It also can be by those traumatic and conflict responses that we see in meta health. And obviously, usually, both can be true at the same time. And now this is a complicated one. I took this from Dr. Naviaux's own website, and I want to walk you through that in order to not like scare you away. So the kind of healing cycle that he is describing here is quite similar to Dr. Hammer's healing cycle that we saw in the first slide that I shared. Right, in the upper part of this graphic, I don't know if you can see my mouse here. You see this this health cycle of wakeful activity and restorative sleep, right? So that's basically the same kind of thing that we already know, that we always, and this is the normal thing where the mitochondria are working, where we have this aerobic glycolysis and others too. And OXPHOS is oxidative phosphorylation, right? Something like that. And that's the way where the biochemical way how this happens. We in meta health don't need to discuss that yet, but it's very inspiring to do this perhaps in a work group. Okay, and then we see here in the upper right-hand corner, you see this CDR on. So that's the first point where this disease healing cycle starts, right? And we see this here. Oh, here comes new information: stress, injury, toxins, infection, adjuvants, metals, pollution, all of that, all of those exceptions from Dr. Hammer's concept. But he doesn't exclude stress. He doesn't exclude trauma, right? So here we have something that is actually including everything. And he claims it's the same kind of health cycle and healing cycle for all of those. Let's check this out, right? The first phase we're entering in is the phase of after this stressor, which is creating usually a cell loss or excitotoxicity, right? So when this happens, like a wound, like I had when we lately were hiking and I fell upon my knee and it was bloody and all of that. And then my body almost directly started to heal. But obviously, first there was something about the putting out anything that could be toxic to my system. So there was bleeding. There certainly was there was no inflammation. Actually, I didn't need to. But usually, what would happen if something would have gotten deeper into me? This would have gotten an inflammatory response, right? So we would have a phase, like a stress phase, of a containment and defense phase, we could say, right? And that's the red one, CDR1. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I would compare that to in Dr. Hammer's model. We have biological stressors or trauma that can cause this danger response or this stress phase, right? And then we have this defensive reaction inside a stress phase, which just makes sense. And for Dr. Hammer's model, it's going a little bit beyond that, that kind of immunity, because it could be a plus or a minus that's happening. And and we can explore this later. So I'm so keen to do this, but not in today's webinar. So the time wouldn't allow for that yet, I think. Well, actually, when we can't get out of that first phase, this first defensive stress phase, this can lead to excess metabolic damage, as he writes, and some certain symptoms or diagnosis that we also might see in mental health clients, like a necrosis, like apoptosis, and so on and so on. This is a minus response, right? We see a minus response here in a stress phase of the cell danger response. Okay. And then at a certain point, and he puts it as a CP, as a checkpoint 1. You see this here below in the end of the red phase, and at the beginning of the blue phase, you see the CP1 would be a certain checkpoint, which is, and then we are entering into another phase, which is about proliferation. Proliferation is wound healing by creating plus in the tissue again and filling this up, right? And yeah, okay, so what is this according to our model? Regeneration trigger, right? So danger is over, everything is contained, and now we can start our regeneration phase, right? So this is, until now, it's quite similar, right? Even, and we see again some symptoms if we don't succeed in getting out of this proliferation phase. Then this could lead to granuloma, gliosis, fibrosis, and scarring. And if we, at the same time, or so having a DNA damage for our genetics, right, it is leading to premature aging, senescence, right? Also, that is happening there because we want to heal, but there's already something happening, some kind of scarring and some kind of changes in our blueprint, in our DNA, that's then changed, and it's not allowing us to fully recover to the full kinds of functions and the full kind of form that we usually would have, right? So here we have CDR2. So the second phase here is about proliferation, about healing. Okay, and then we see there's another phase, the CDR3, and we have another checkpoint, checkpoint 2, whatever this may be, but it is then leading to a phase of differentiation and development, which means that regain of our function, right? So proliferation is happening, so our wounds are filled up and so on. Hopefully we can get out of this phase and then regain our full function. Well, we have heard that before in my little webinar today. We had the plus reaction in regeneration phase, and the CP2 kind of mirrors the healing peak, the reversal of the regeneration phase. Right? We had the proliferative phase, so or the where we really are trying to start regeneration, and then in the end, in the second phase, we want to regain our normal functioning. And if that doesn't happen, because we're getting stuck there, it also has some implications and can lead to, what does he say? Autoimmunity, excitotoxicity, chronic pain, neurologic and psychiatric symptoms, right? So, and that's very interesting to us, because in regeneration phase B, and if we can't get out of this, it leads to chronic patterns that we are going through, this kind of typical autoimmunity, where we say, well, you're triggered over and over and over again, right? And going into the same kind of reaction pattern. Or psychiatric symptoms, psychological symptoms, which we see in constellations, which is our body is trying to create a different strategy yet, and giving us certain things, how we then react different from our environment, right? Which might be another type of trying to come to a kind of resolution by changing also our psychological strategy in approaching our conflicts, right? So that's what I really found lots of interesting, that we are coming to a healing cycle and to those insights which are so very similar to what Dr. Hammer described. And this is even true for ourselves, right? Then when we are succeeding and getting through the next phase, this CDR3 phase, then we are coming to the end of that process and to auto-regulation, right? So this would be the checkpoint 3, which is the same as this kind of auto-regulation when our regeneration phase B would be completed. And then we are back to wakeful activity and restorative sleep and so on and so on. Isn't that interesting to see? I think so. Well, now that you have been following me for that long, let's look a little bit at that, what we usually do in order to help and in order to heal or in order to manage. So usually when we go to a doctor, we're going for some medication, or most of us do. The guy with his fisherman hands didn't. I try to avoid it if I can, right? But if we cannot, then certain medication, we do that to disturb that process when we just can't cope with its implications, with the pain, with the kind of function change, with the kind of tissue change, to just make it more endurable for us, right? Like also Dr. Hammer used those adrenal hormones like cortisone to get over those potentially dangerous healing peaks in his patients, right? So he was also a man of conventional medicine, and he was not a lot into alternative styles, which we obviously embrace. So anything has its place in mental health, depending on what's the right thing in the right situation and for the right person. So but what we need to know is that obviously also from this healing cycle, usually that medication, if it's not really for emergency treatment, is not really the necessary thing that we need for healing, but we need it for the management of symptoms. But at the same time, that's the other side of the coin again. Medication can also act or be reacted upon with a cell danger response, right? Something, because medication can be toxic. It doesn't only have the effects that we want it to have, it can have side effects. And then again, cell danger response can be put on. So long-term medication or excessive use of medication can bring those kinds of negative effects, which we don't want to have. And by that also weaken our capability to self-regulate, for the body to self-regulate. So that's why we want to help people to not need to do that and to have other kinds of resources that they can take to. So, and this is also what Dr. Naviaux is talking about, because on his page, I also saw this kind of graphic and this quote. And this is about salugenesis. We know salutogenesis in mental health because that's the concept we're working with. And he said, well, this is salugenesis, also a creation of health, right? Moving out of the way for health in this cycle. So salugens are interventions that promote the completion of the healing cycle to restore health, decrease mortality, and create heightened states of health and resilience, says Dr. Naviaux. And so we again see a little cycle here with all of those things that can put on the cell danger response down here, like the trauma, pollution, genes, infections, tobacco, toxins, poor nutrition, all of that stuff that Dr. Hammer says, well, if that's the case, doesn't really react in the style that I'm describing, right? So here we look to Dr. Naviaux for that. And those things can lead to those chronic conditions, to aging and disease. And so in this so-called first book of medicine, so this is a lot about knowing how we get to those conditions, to disease, and about management, about engineering, like in emergency medicine. And we obviously need that very much, but that's not the whole picture. We also need a second book of medicine, which is leading us from those conditions that the first book couldn't really help us with, from those conditions back towards health. And here you see in the graphic that we see in the beginning, we see M1. This is a certain form the mitochondria are taking, right? The pro-inflammatory form and the uncommitted form and the anti-inflammatory form, right? Until we are back to health. And the second book of medicine is about salugenesis, about finding the right thing that is making us more resilient and leading us back to health, even if there are those kinds of stresses and stuff around, and toxins and whatever. Because obviously they exist. And it's something that's very interesting for us as mental health practitioners to know, and for everybody to know, actually. So let's look at salugens. What's that? And Dr. Naviaux is saying, I'm just quoting here, salugens create an integrated multi-system resistance to future chronic illness. That sounds good. So what's that? And they don't need to be drugs. Salugens don't need to be drugs. Oh, that's good. That's good for me. Like exercise is a salugen. In the first graphic, you see me in my morning routine. So, exercise is a salugen. So because it is making us more resilient, because it's giving us a certain good challenge. It's challenging our body, but not too much. Adaptogens, which are herbs that promote resilience, and they are also called stress vaccines, and they are also salugens. Vaccines, I'm not so much into vaccines usually, but the thought about this is, like the exercise, it is giving you, presenting you with a certain type of stress, but with the good stress, which is making you more resilient. And adaptogens are those herbs that are described as not giving you a lot of negative effects. right? And in the last slide, I'm also linking to a site where you can find much more information about those if you're interested. And then there are other interventions that Dr. Naviaux knew about, like certain electrophysiologic interventions designed to promote healing associated with slow wave sleep, good regenerative sleep. And they are also salugens. Okay, so there are interventions we can do that are getting us back via certain things we do to our body and to our soul also, right? That are bringing us back to the path of health. Good to know. And then we look in meta health, right? I should say, as far as I know, also music and sound and frequency and meditation and our self-help techniques that are such as the tapping method and other methods that we're having, they should also be mentioned as salugens for me, right? As are the meta meanings that we're looking out for and finding out in our meta health coaching and therapy. Just like in my little story from the beginning, like finding out, so what is this really about and what can I do to stop this kind of thing going on, to stop this being a trigger for me, right? The decision my fisherman made to not need to be a fisherman any longer. So now let's bring this all together and look to our salugenesis concept that we apply in meta health. Right, you saw this slide before about those 3 pillars that Aaron Antonovsky found were at the base of creating health. When those 3 are in coherence, the comprehensibility, meaningfulness, and manageability of my life and my life situation, right? Then this is giving me the base for good health. And we're using this in meta health by making things more comprehensible, meaningful, and also manageable. And this is, in the first place, this how can I deal with this situation or with this stuff is what we have looked upon now when we were seeing those salugens, right? Which can be any kinds of practices, lifestyle methods, or also certain herbs or even certain drugs, right? But also those inner resources that we are accessing, our anchors to them, our co-regulation with other people, our emotional release techniques, the renegotiation of our conflicts, and then, of course, also medication if we need it, right? So just think about it. If we take this into the scope also for the cell danger response, if we can renegotiate, if we can think differently about those kinds of toxins or those kinds of physical trauma, how much can we facilitate a good way back to health when we do that? Right? When we co-regulate with others, when we don't have those overlapping processes where we feel all alone. You see, everything is really merging into each other in meta health. And now when we have this new concept as well. So that's what is inspiring me really tons. It also adds to our understanding what's happening when we know about the cell danger response. We already knew about like those kinds of the root causes, and we are looking for the soil of our health and our disease. Like, what are our imprints? What are those things that are happening to us over and over again, and that our conflict triggers and so on. So if we know about them, if we understand what this is about, we can do something about it, right? So also here, those things add and come together. What we already know from Dr. Hamer's concept and also Dr. Porges concept and in the polyvagal theory that taught us a lot. And then now, of course, also Dr. Hammer and now Dr. Naviaux. And many others that are also adding to this. But I think this is really brilliantly completing each other, those means of research. And then here, the most important thing for this coherence, this heart coherence for resilience, is to see meaning. We are always, our brains, human brains, always want to make meaning and see a meaning in what we are experiencing, right? And that's what we are going for and diving into and using in meta health to look for meaning or even to create a meaning. If there's no meaning, somebody needs a meaning. Oh yeah, we can come up with a meaning, right? So there is biological meaning that Dr. Hammer has shown to us, or also Dr. Naviaux has shown to us, or Dr. Porges has shown to us. In the kinds of responses we are, the kinds of symptoms we're experiencing, we can look for our individual meaning, just like I was asking my fisherman, right, for his individual meaning of what was happening with his hands, right? We can look for a greater meaning of the whole thing, right? And which is already really kind of a meta meaning of what we are experiencing. So if it doesn't really make meaning for me as individual, and I can't really gain from that, but perhaps, well, the universe can gain from it, or the world can gain from it, or my kind at least can gain from it, right? There can be a greater meaning that I can look out for. And the meaningfulness in my individual meaning of a conflict, right? So if I'm having something and I'm experiencing something, well, even that I do this, that I experience going through all that, this can actually be a meaningful thing for me and my history, my ancestors, and so on, right? A possibility for healing. And now we're really getting into those meta meanings, those healing insights that we are going for in meta health, which is actually those insights that, as I got my guy into the kind of what decision can you make now to not need your skin to help you in this any longer, right? So which would be the healing insight for him? And for him, it was, well, I can actually have another thing that I really can take hold of, and that is feeling so good in my hands, right? So, and that's what we're going for in meta health. And now I hope that also the insights we're getting from knowing from the cell danger response is helping us in that, or that our knowledge and understanding of meta health and Dr. Hammer's concept is also adding to the knowledge inside the research of the cell danger response and what to do with this, and what can also be salugens. Good. Now, I think that's the last slide. So the consequences for us now is really like what builds the soil, not only for disease, but for resilience. So this is the support on all of those levels that we here see in the graphic of those 8 points or 8 milestones, or call it what you will, of meta health. And we're looking at our body, at our mind, and our environment, not only the social environment, but also the physical environment, right? So we need to support our bodies and souls on all of those levels. And every kind of support, wherever we start to do that, is also facilitating the healing and health on the other levels. So we can compensate a big deal by kind of renegotiating the kind of conflict or even the kinds of trauma, even if it's physical trauma. I know of certain toxins. Well, if I'm not afraid to eat that And I really feel good with that. And I can test, make a kinesiological muscle test, and it tells me, yeah, you can. And I do it, and it doesn't harm me. So if I can do that, I can also like switch off a cell danger response at a certain point, right? So I don't say I can take any kind of toxins or something. So I'm not that arrogant, but I'm a little bit arrogant because I made such experiences in mental health that we can compensate a lot. And the more resources I have on one certain level, I can bring it into those other levels as well, and kind of deflate the volume of those kinds of conflicts that I'm having on those levels. So we in meta health should not focus only on that analysis of the certain symptoms. Of course, we want to do this, but as it is so many factors going into this, and we can't know all of these perhaps, right? But we use all the information that we're having, that we can get, make meaning out of it, and optimize the conditions for health and healing. So that's what we can do on all of those levels, with our meta meanings, with our salugens, with our with our life and our lifestyle practices. So yeah, let everybody here consider our own scope to prepare the soil for health and resilience on those levels of our organs, of our individual symptoms, the triggers, the emotions, the beliefs and thoughts, our interaction and co-regulation with others, our lifestyle, and then our identity. Who am I? And who do I belong to? Right? So now this is what I want to share with you today. Here is a slide where I'm giving you some more, both the sources I have been using. You find them in the publications here on of Dr. Naviaux' website, and then some which I found on some other sites, which I mentioned here. And here, then you can also read something about adaptogens, which I find quite inspiring too. So then you can, do some more study and reading. But for today, I thank you for being with me in and following through this presentation. Be meta healthy. And now I'm stopping my screen share.